Hello, welcome to Rethinking the Six Wives of Henry VIII. In this episode, we are talking Anne Boleyn. So very briefly, if you don't know who Anne Boleyn was the second wife of Henry VIII. She was the first Queen of England to be executed, and she was also the mother to Elizabeth, who then became Elizabeth I, known as the Virgin Queen or Gloriana. So what legacies have been left of Anne Boleyn? Well, we think of her as the first Queen of England to be executed. Okay, fair enough. But then we have these two opposing sides when it comes to the legend of Anne. We either think of her as this guilty, whore, concubine, adulterous, incestuous woman, or we think of her as this innocent victim. And in my opinion, I don't think she was either of those. Now, I'm not saying she was guilty of the charges laid against her because, let's be honest, they're a load of poo. But I don't think she's innocent either. She knew exactly what she was doing, she knew exactly the game that she was playing, and she often predicted her career would end in death. She was someone who was always on that line or just stepping over it. And for that reason, I think she lies somewhere in the middle. Neither this guilty concubine or this innocent victim. And I think Anne herself would agree. So what are the legacies that I think Anne Boleyn deserves to be known for throughout history? Well, I believe she should be known for being a highly intelligent woman, one of the greatest game players that English history's ever known, always true to herself and dignified at her darkest hour. So let's take the first legacy that I think she deserved to have, which is that she's a highly intelligent woman. So Anne showed high levels of intelligence from an early age. At the age of 12, she was sent off to the Netherlands, then she was sent off to France. And from this, she was educated. She learnt, of course, languages. When she came back to England, people took her for a fine French lady. They didn't take her for an English maiden. She also learnt courtly ways, she learnt poise, she learnt manners, she learnt how to dance, she learnt more about music and loved music. But she also learnt more about religion and religious reform. And she also learnt what we would perhaps describe as feminism or undercurrent of women's rights, I think is probably the better way to put it. It's interesting. Anne's views on women and what women can achieve, because of course Anne Boleyn set out to achieve some great things herself. Now, I don't want this series to be about him because I'm not the greatest fan of him, but we do have to very briefly talk about Henry to understand why Anne's intelligence is a legacy that is so important and that's so important for people to know about. And that is because Henry loved hanging out with intellectual people. I mean, Henry was an intelligent man himself, but he loved hanging out with the greats, the geniuses. People like Sir Thomas More. He could spend hours and hours and hours locked in a room with Sir Thomas More. They could look up at the stars, they could discuss theology and learning, and he would absolutely, Henry that is, relish in it. He loved it. He loved talking science and the arts. He loved talking about learning, he loved talking about books, and of course matters of religion. And then of course in comes Anne. And in Anne, Henry finds all of that, but in a female form. So not only was he sexually attracted to her and someone that he could have sexual relations with, but this was a woman who he could have the same sort of discussions, intellectual discussions that is, that he has with his closest advisors and friends. People like Sir Thomas More, he spent hours and hours with, debating, discussing, and here he could do the same with Anne, a woman. Because Anne, of course, was a woman of substance. She had a genuine interest in learning, in bettering herself, in educating herself. and a real interest in theology and religious matters. Now, when we think of the religious women surrounding Henry and his religious wives, we tend to think of one end of the spectrum or other. We think of Catherine of Aragon, devout Catholic, or we go all the way to the end with Catherine Parr, who her religious views in comparison to Catherine of Aragon were pretty much completely the opposite. And we don't necessarily think of Anne Boleyn, but Anne Boleyn was an extremely pious woman. She loved reading religious text. She even had a copy of William Tinsdale's English Bible in her chambers, and she encouraged the people that waited on her, the ladies and gentlemen, to go and read it. She wanted people to better themselves and to educate themselves, and she often, of course, read from it too. And of course, Anne also got Henry some banned material, some banned religious texts. One of these included William Tinsdale's book on the obedience of the Christian man. And in there is a quote: "King is judge over all, and over him there is no judge." And it was this quote that got Henry thinking, actually, I am the next person to God, not the Pope. And Anne was just there, dropping her religious seeds. And it takes a highly intelligent woman to do all those things. The next legacy I think Anne deserves to have is that she was the greatest game player, and actually one of the greatest game players that English history and British history has ever known. Anne came to court in the early 1520s when Anne herself was in her early 20s, and she wasn't a looker, shall we say. She wasn't a conventional beauty at the time. The conventional beauty was everything fair. Lovely, fair, honey-like hair, fair skin and eyes, everything just looking like an English rose. But Anne wasn't that. Anne was dark, darker eyes, darker hair, darker skin tone, and that wasn't the conventional beautiful. But it didn't matter, because Anne had something about her. She had an allure, and her personality just shone out from her. But Anne was sexy. Anne was flirty by nature, but she oozed sex appeal. She had this sexuality about her that just radiated off her, and people found very attractive. She was very feisty with it, and she was witty with it. And despite the fact that she wasn't the conventional beauty, it was her personality shining out of her that people found beautiful and alluring. This air of confidence people were just completely taken in by. And of course, as I said before, when she came to court, people didn't think she was this English maiden. People thought that she was this fine French lady. After all, she dressed in the French fashions, and she spoke impeccable French. Now, by about 1525-ish, she caught the eye of Henry VIII. I mean, she had been at court already, but it took a little while for him to notice her in this way. And it was a tricky one, this, because we can interpret how Anne took Henry's notions, shall we say, in two ways. We can either say Anne resisted, and she didn't want Henry at all. She went to Hever Castle, away from court, to get away from him. And then eventually, for whatever reason, she changed her mind and she decided, okay. Or we can think of it as she's playing this game and she's blowing hot and blowing cold, because when she stayed away from court, it made Henry want her more. And it's a little bit tricky to know which one. But it's your interpretation. Whether you think she didn't want him at all and she ran away back home to Hever and then changed her mind, or she was playing a game. Either which, it was an interesting start to a relationship. While Anne was at Hever, Henry sent her gifts, he sent her letters. Now, it's quite sad really, because we only have half the side of the letters between Anne and Henry, but they tell this beautiful, lovesick schoolboy who, honestly, it's like he's a teenager. It's like he's a 13-year-old boy. And here he is writing, and he writes their initials and then he puts a little heart around them. And it's quite sweet. And it matters a great deal, these letters, because Henry hated writing. He would never write. Anything that involved writing, he'd pass off that job to somebody else. But here he was writing to his sweetheart. Whether Anne felt the same way is another matter. But whatever side of the story we're going from, whether she wanted his advances or not, eventually she kind of went okay. But she did something very clever, because she said, "I will be your wife, but not your mistress." So of course this meant that if Henry wanted to bed her, which of course he did, he had to make her his wife. And to make her his wife, he had to divorce his previous wife, his true wife, the Princess of Spain, Catherine of Aragon. Now, something I find very interesting about Anne is her relationship with the people. The people of England definitely sympathised more with Catherine. Catherine was their true queen. She came in 1501, she married one prince and then a king. And it was like a fairy tale. And they thought that she was the true queen. She was still living, she was still Henry's wife. They didn't really want to accept Anne. However, Anne was popular in small circles. Of course, she was an integral part of the Reformation and religious reform. So, of course, she was small, little popular circles. But mostly people sided with Catherine. Understandable. And Anne decided to change her mottos to suit this, and I thought it was quite funny. She did various, one of which was "Let who will complain," which I think is always a fun one. And of course, the lovely "The most happy," which is probably best known for. Anne had so much strength within her to play the game. It was a difficult game for her to play because here she was trying to usurp a rightful queen. She said, "Yes, okay, Henry, I will be with you, but only as wife." And so that means knocking off his current wife and current queen. And it takes some guts to do that. But it is said that she had the courage of a lion, especially when it comes to talking to Catherine and Mary. She often said about Mary, "She is my death and I am hers," which sort of becomes true. And then same goes through into the next generation between Mary and Elizabeth. But also her courage when it talking to Catherine and talking about Catherine, because she said about Spaniards wanting them to be at the bottom of the sea, which, saying that to a queen, you've got to have some guts to do that. She also disposed of people that got in her way. Mary got in her way and she managed to push her aside, Henry's daughter. Catherine was in her way and eventually, after years, managed to get that divorce and allow Anne and Henry to marry. But other people, like Cardinal Wolsey, he got in her way and she disposed of him as well. Anyone that was threatening towards Anne, she managed to dispose of. They said about her relationship with Henry that it was like storms one minute and sunshine the next, because they would have these tremendous rows, but then of course have extremely passionate makeups because the love was there. He was completely in love with her, and it helped her play the game. Now, we're talking about gameplay here. So you may say that because of how Anne ends up, you may think actually she lost the game ultimately. Now, did she? I mean, of course, yes, Anne herself was executed, but her legacy in her daughter, Elizabeth, in my personal opinion, a lot of other people's opinion, is the greatest monarch that English history has ever known. Now, I think that's playing a pretty good game. The next legacy that I think Anne deserves to have is that she was always true to herself. And by this, I just mean that she was always her all the way through. How can I describe Anne Boleyn? Well, she was chic, confident, feisty, charming, witty, courageous, sophisticated, notorious, vivacious. She oozed sex appeal. And Anne never changed that. She was the same from before she married Henry to after she married Henry. And you could essentially call her like the first modern queen, I guess, because she had her own opinions of what she wanted to implement in terms of law and practice for the people, particularly things about religious and poor laws. Now, the way she spoke to Henry was effectively like giving him orders. It wasn't what he was used to from a queen at all. I mean, Catherine was very much of a traditional queen. She was the mother of the people. She was absolutely beloved. Anne was there, and she was having ideas herself. And she almost, in a way, gave Henry orders. Now, Henry kind of liked this in a way at the beginning, because no woman had ever spoken to him like this. This is a woman who is very superiorly intellectual, and he found it fascinating. And when they marry, Anne never changes. And this is a big problem, because what drove Henry wild with passion when they weren't married, her personality, her wit, her charm, her charisma, it drove Henry wild with passion, this blowing hot, blowing cold, etc. But when he's married to her, he wants something different from her. He loves her, but he wants her to be that good queen that Catherine was. And Anne's not like that. And you can kind of see it from Anne's point of view. They've been together for many, many years. So why is he suddenly expecting her to change? And she doesn't change. However, whenever she does cross that line, she's always able to come back. They have big rows, but then big makeups too. Now, Anne predicted her career would end in death, but she stayed true to herself anyway. And when she feels like she is falling and there is a risk of danger, what she looks to do is she looks to the future, and she looks to the person that she loves most in the world, and that is to little Elizabeth. And what she does, she's wonderful. She looks to protect her. She looks at people around her and she puts them in place to look after Elizabeth. Only 6 weeks before her execution, Anne orders new clothes for Elizabeth. Elizabeth is Anne's world. Anne adores her. And what Anne does is look to try and protect her as much as she can. And even in the Tower, once she's arrested, she's still being the witty Anne that we know. She is still witty and charming, but this wit and this charm turns black. On the 18th of May, the day before her execution, she has a conversation and she says, "I have a little neck," and she puts her hands around her throat and laughs like it's a joke. Even at the darkest times, she's still being Anne. The last legacy that I believe Anne deserves is that she was dignified at her darkest hour. Now, as a nation, we don't really go round executing our queens. It's not really a done thing. And I do think there is this forgotten dignity when it comes to the death of Anne, because she must have absolutely been scared to death. When she's first arrested, she's quite confused. And she goes through these motions. Her mood changes. 1 minute she's terrified. The next she's thinking, Henry will save her, it's fine. Then she thinks, Henry's just testing me. And then finally she's just resting hope. and she's hoping that Henry remembers all the happy times and the amount of love that he had for her. Anne Boleyn's trial was on the 15th of May, and let's be honest, the verdict of guilty was fixed beforehand. I mean, her executioner would have most likely have been asked for by this point already. He would have already been sent for. I mean, if that doesn't scream guilty, I don't know what does. On the 15th of May, Anne does get her trial and she does get to hear her charges. Now, they're all ludicrous, as we know. Well, most of us do. But the charges are quite interesting because, of course, they're there for a purpose, but we, hundreds of years later, can dismiss half of them very easily by easily proving Anne was not there at wherever said place she was meant to be, or said man was not there. And it's very difficult to have sexual relationships when you're not in the same place as said other person that's meant to be there with you. Now, the charges there, particularly something like the incest charge, was there not just to show that Anne was a bad person, but to blacken not just her name, but the Boleyn name, and not just for this generation, but for centuries to come. It was to turn her own sex appeal, her charisma, her wit, her flirtatious, her personality. It was just to turn herself against her. Now, Anne does get a chance to speak at her trial, and let's be honest, she could absolutely go in for it, couldn't she? But she doesn't. At her trial, she admits to being jealous and suspicious of Henry, which is quite remarkable, really. It shows how brave she was when she knew that what was going to happen and she was going to be executed. She accepted her fate like a real brave woman. On the day of her execution, she chose her outfit carefully. She wore a crimson kirtle, which is the colour of martyrdom, and she wore an ermine mantle. Now, ermine is reserved for royalty. So here she was, despite the fact that technically she wasn't queen anymore, her marriage had been annulled, here she was, still showing herself off as queen. So when you next think of Anne, think of her as a highly intelligent woman, a fantastic game player, someone who is always true to herself and dignified at her darkest hour. I hope you have enjoyed this documentary on Anne Boleyn. If you have, please give it a big thumbs up. Chat to me in the comments, all things Anne, and I shall see you soon for the next video. Bye for now.